Invasive species. In this lesson, we're talking about invasive species versus native species, the effect of invasive species on an ecosystem, and then we're going to talk about the small Asian mongoose, which is an example of an invasive species. We're going to talk about controlling invasive species, and then we're going to talk about 5 additional extreme invasive species. What is an invasive species? What is a native species? So what I'd like you to do now is pause the video and come up with a definition for both by yourself and write it down. Native species. A native species are species that are found in an area as a result of natural processes only. And the key word here is natural processes. They're not being brought in by people, and they're not being helped to stay there by people. They have developed naturally in a given area over time. Now, as we move on to invasive species, what I'd like you to do is pause the video and watch number 1, the story of Bunny. Invasive species are non-native, so not naturally found species, which are added to an area. They can be natural through migration due to habitat loss or range extension, or can be the result of human activity. Generally, they are a threat to the natural biodiversity of an area because they take over. Examples of this, things like zebra mussels, Asian carps, cane toads, Japanese beetles. So let's delve into the Japanese beetle a little bit. So the Japanese beetle was accidentally brought to the United States from Japan around 1916 in the soil around imported plants. So this is a human-brought invasive species, but it was accidental. They're known to feed on more than 200 species of plants, including a wide variety of trees, shrubs, grasses, and nursery plants. Adults consume the leaf material between the veins, killing the plant, and will also feed on the fruit on the plants if present. So here's the life cycle of a Japanese beetle. So you can see the larvae are going to feed on the roots. That's going to be these guys down here. They're going to feed on the roots of the plants, and then the adults are going to start feeding on the stems. So if you've ever been to an airport or gone through a border crossing, they might ask you if you're bringing any kind of plant or other kind of food over, and they're worried about this kind of thing. They're worried about things like the Japanese beetle coming over accidentally in the plant that you're bringing over or in the food that you're bringing over. So another example of invasive species is the kudzu plant. The kudzu plant was introduced to the United States from Japan as an ornamental plant to be used to shade porches. So this one was brought over on purpose. It now covers most of the southeastern United States, and it grows about a foot per day, covers 150,000 acres per year, and costs the U.S. an estimated $6 million annually just to keep it at bay so that it doesn't take over. The effect of an invasive species on an ecosystem. So there's 4 major threats invasive species pose. They can alter the ecosystem, they can destroy forests, crops, or both, they can reduce the beauty or use of the land, and they can introduce disease or other negative health effects. So let's go through each one. Number 1, alter the ecosystem. Invasive species grow in numbers very quickly, and this is usually due to a lack of predators. The increased population of invasive species will need food. This leads to a decline in available food for the native species, which leads to a decline or extinction of the native population. So you can see in the graph right here, the population graph pattern for a newly introduced species is rapid. So as soon as they're brought in, they're going to take over. If there's no predators in the area, so for instance, you saw the video earlier about the bunny, right? The story of Bunny. When the bunny was brought over, there was nothing that would eat the bunny. So the bunny was able to populate very quickly. And you can see how its number would skyrocket because of the available food and lack of predators. There's nothing to eat it, and their numbers can jump quickly. Now, eventually, they're going to reach a peak population where the land around them can only sustain them so much. So, for example, let's just say you introduce invasive species A to an area that had native species B. Now, in this particular area, there's no predators for A, and there's lots of food. Now, what's going to happen with the population of A? It's going to increase substantially because there's nothing that's going to eat it. It's going to eat all the food. Now, what food is it going to eat? It's going to eat the food that would normally be eaten by B and potentially lead to endangerment or extinction of species B, simply due to the lack of food and the overcompetition from A. Number 2, it can destroy forests and crops. Invasive species eat a lot of food they normally get from native trees and plants. They also love to feed on farm crops such as corn. An example of an invasive species that destroys forests and crops is the long-tailed possums. There are 35 million of them in New Zealand, and they consume 12,000 tons of vegetation every single night. That's as much weight as 110 million hamburgers. So that's a lot of plant material eaten every single night by these guys. And they were brought in to help with the fur trade. So people wanted to bring them in so that they could essentially shoot them and make things out of their fur. Well, unfortunately, they flourished, and possums do very well at night and hide during the day, so they were very hard to kill. So since they're hard to kill and there's a lot of plant matter to eat, their populations went up significantly, and the hunters didn't have any luck in getting rid of them. Number 3, reduce the beauty or use of the land. Invasive species reduce the water quality and beauty of the landscape. This will negatively impact wildlife viewing. Various invasive species can also prevent the enjoyment of natural activities such as swimming and boating. So for example, the Asian carp. So to get a better idea of what these guys do, pause the video and watch number 2. You can see how big they are. And the thing is, they jump out of the water, and they're these huge things, and they jump out of the water when they get disturbed by things like boats and other people. So again, pause the video, watch number 2, and you'll see what I mean. Number 4, the introduction of disease and the health risks. Certain invasive species can introduce diseases previously found in other regions or countries. So for example, mosquitoes bringing in the West Nile virus. Additionally, Pesticides, which are sprayed to reduce the native species population, can get into groundwater and affect both wildlife and human health. So not only can the invasive species affect our health, but the stuff that we use to try to kill the invasive species can also affect our health. So let's take a look at the small Asian mongoose. So in the 1880s, Hawaii's sugar canes were being eaten by the local rats. So what happened? Well, one man brought over a small Asian mongoose, which was supposed to eat the rats and eliminate the problem. Unfortunately, the mongoose instead decided to eat the local birds and turtles, which were much easier to catch. Mongooses breed very quickly and soon their population soared. Currently, they cause approximately $50 million in damages to the Hawaiian and the Puerto Rican islands every single year. Controlling invasive species. So what do we do? Well, it's important to prevent the introduction of invasive species, but if they are introduced, you must find a way to get rid of them, which can be very difficult. There are three main ways to control them: chemical, mechanical, and biological control. Number one, chemical control. The use of pesticides is chemical control. A pesticide is any substance used to kill, repel, or control certain forms of plant or animal life that are considered to be pests. These pesticides can leach into waterways and soil, which creates significant health risks to everyone, like we were talking about before. Number two, mechanical control. Mechanical control is creating barriers, so things like fences, to prevent the movement of species from one location to another, and removing them by cutting down trees, hunting and trapping, or by destroying regions of land to prevent spreading. So this guy right down here is showing the mechanical harvesting of water chestnuts. Water chestnut is an invasive species, so they're trying to physically get rid of them. Number three, biological control. Probably the least effective, because unfortunately if you bring in a species to control the invasive species, you're also bringing in a new invasive species, like we saw with this small Asian mongoose. So biological control is bringing in a species from another location which can be used to hunt and kill the invasive species. Unfortunately, the organism that is brought in to remove the invasive species is also an invasive species and can become just as troublesome or worse. So for example, the cane toad was introduced to Hawaii, the Caribbean, and the Philippines to fight pests in sugarcane fields. Unfortunately, the cane toad will eat most things that fit into its huge mouth, and this has led to the endangerment of native insects and birds in Hawaii. So to finish it off, what I'd like you to do is pause the video and watch number 5. That's going to go through 5 extreme cases of invasive species, including the Asian carp, which we talked about earlier, golden bamboo, rabbits, starlings, and cane toads. They're all really interesting, and they tie in very well to what we've been talking about. Once you've done that, you'll have concluded the lesson on invasive species.